Have you ever felt invisible, like a ghost polishing silver in a world of glittering people who look right through you? For Chiara Jensen, a 24-year-old waitress drowning in debt that was her every waking moment. But what happens when the one person who finally sees you does so only to make you a pawn in a cruel game of public humiliation? This isn't a fairy tale. This is the story of a night in a Manhattan penthouse where a dismissive millionaire, a forgotten piano, and a secret buried by tragedy were set on a collision course. What he intended as her most shameful moment was about to become the performance that would expose everyone's true character, including her own. The clatter of porcelain on saucer was the soundtrack to Chiara Jensen's life. It was a rhythm of servitude, a percussive reminder of the 5-block walk from her cramped Queens apartment to the E train, the 40-minute ride crammed against strangers, and the final ascent into the hushed cathedral-like opulence of the Gilded Sparrow. The restaurant, a bastion of Manhattan's old money and new tech bros, prided itself on its 3 Michelin stars and its discretion. For Chiara, it was a high-wire act performed over a chasm of overdue bills and her younger brother's impending college tuition. Her uniform, a starched white shirt, a slim black tie, and an apron so black it seemed to drink the light, was a suit of armor and a costume of invisibility. She moved with an economy of motion, learned from 2 years of weaving through tightly packed tables, her face set in a mask of pleasant neutrality. She could anticipate the need for a water refill from a subtle glance, could tell by the tilt of her head whether a diner wanted the check or another glass of the $400 Chateau Margaux. She was by all accounts an exemplary waitress, and no one knew her name. She was Miss or Excuse me, or most often a silent, beckoning gesture. She preferred it that way. Anonymity was a shield. It kept the ghosts at bay. The ghosts were always loudest when she was tired, like tonight. A double shift. Her feet throbbed in her sensible non-slip black shoes. Her smile felt shellacked onto her face. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the lights of New York City glittered like a fallen constellation, a promise of a life she could see but never touch. Then he walked in. Douglas Croft. Even if you didn't know his name, you knew his type. He didn't walk. He made an entrance. At 35, he possessed the sharp, predatory grace of a man who had never been told no. His suit was a custom-tailored Tom Ford, the color of a stormy sea, fitting his athletic frame with a precision that screamed wealth. His hair was dark, artfully disheveled, and his eyes were a startlingly cold blue. He moved with an aura of frictionless power, the kind that bent the world to his will without ever having to ask. With him was his fiancée Tinsley Harrington, a woman who looked less like a person and more like an Instagram filter, brought to life all sharp angles, brand names, and a practiced pout. They were seated in Chiara's section. Table 12, the best in the house, nestled in a corner alcove with a panoramic view of Central Park. I'll have a bottle of the Screaming Eagle. The 15 Douglas said, not looking at Chiara, but at the menu, as if the words themselves were more worthy of his attention. He didn't ask. He commanded. An excellent choice, sir. Chiara replied, her voice smooth and professional, betraying none of the internal calculations. A single bottle of that wine cost more than her rent for 3 months. It was a casual Tuesday night purchase for him. As she served them, she felt the familiar weight of his gaze. It wasn't the lecherous once-over she sometimes got from drunk finance guys. It was different. It was analytical. Appraising, like a biologist studying an insect. He watched her hands as she poured the wine, her movements steady and precise. He watched her face as she described the specials, her expression unchanging. "You're very efficient," he remarked, a slight curl to his lip. It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation, delivered with the same emotional detachment one might use to describe a well-oiled machine. "Thank you, sir," she said, her shield of neutrality firmly in place. Tinsley giggled a sound like tiny, expensive bells. "Dammy, don't bother the help. She's just doing her job." The word help landed like a slap. Ciara's jaw tightened for a fraction of a second before she forced it to relax. She retreated from the table, her back straight to the exchange replaying in her mind. It was the casual cruelty that stung the most, the effortless way they dismissed her humanity, reducing her to a function. Back in the kitchen's chaotic symphony of clanging pans and shouted orders, her friend Maya nudged her. "Table 12 is staring again." "What did you do? Forget to kiss the ring?" Ciara forced a weak smile. "He's just intense." Intense? He's Douglas Croft. The guy's a corporate raider. Buys companies, guts them, sells the parts for a profit. They call him the architect, because all that's left is the blueprint of what used to be. Maya wiped her brow with the back of her hand. "My cousin used to work for a company he bought. Said he fired 200 people over a conference call 2 weeks before Christmas. Stay clear of him." The information settled like a stone in Ciara's stomach. She had pegged him as arrogant, but this was a different level of coldness. This was a man who dismantled lives for a living. As the evening wore on, the gnawing feeling in Ciara's gut intensified. Douglas Croft seemed to take a perverse interest in her. He'd call her over for the most trivial reasons to move a salt shaker an inch to the left, to ask an obscure question about the provenance of the parsley in his garnish. Each time he would watch her, with those piercing blue eyes, a faint, unreadable smirk on his face. It felt like a test, a game only he knew the rules to. Ciara had faced difficult customers before, but this was psychological. He was trying to get a reaction, to find a crack in her professional veneer. She refused to give him the satisfaction. She remained polite, efficient, and distant, a perfect automaton. When they finally prepared to leave, he signed the check. As Ciara reached for it, he held on to it for a second too long, his fingers brushing hers. The contact was electric and not in a pleasant way. It felt like a brand. "We're hosting a private party this Saturday," he said, his voice a low murmur. "At my penthouse, a celebration for a recent acquisition." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I was impressed by your professionalism. I want you to work it. My assistant will be in touch with your manager. The pay will be substantial." Ciara's heart hammered against her ribs. Every instinct screamed at her to refuse to run in the opposite direction of this man. But then the numbers flashed in her head, Leo's tuition deposit due in 2 weeks, the looming threat of eviction, the gnawing, constant anxiety of living on the edge, substantial pay. I would have to check my schedule, sir." She managed her voice, betraying a slight tremor. He finally smiled, a genuine, triumphant smile that didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure you will find the time." He released the check holder and stood up, Tinsley clinging to his arm. As they walked away, Ciara glanced down at the tip. He had left exactly 15%. Not a penny more, not a penny less. It was precise, calculated, and utterly impersonal. It was a transaction. Nothing more. That night, Ciara couldn't sleep. The city lights outside her window felt less like a promise and more like a warning. The ghosts were back, whispering in the dark. They were the ghosts of her parents, their smiling faces in old photographs on her dresser. Her father, a Juilliard-trained concert pianist. Her mother, a composer with a wild laugh and even wilder hair. They were the ghosts of melody of sonatas and concertos, that used to fill their sunny, music-filled home. And then, the ghost of the crash. The screech of tires on wet pavement, the shattering of glass, the sudden deafening silence. A silence that had followed Chiara for 8 years. A silence that had stolen not just her parents, but a part of her soul. The piano her father had taught her on a beautiful old Baldwin upright now sat in the corner of her and Leo's tiny apartment, its lid permanently closed, covered with a dusty cloth and a stack of textbooks on corporate finance, her chosen major. A desperate attempt to run as far from the world that had been stolen from her as possible. A world of art and passion that had ended in tragedy and debt. Playing the piano was like breathing for her once. Now the thought of touching the keys sent a spike of pure, unadulterated panic through her chest. The keys were tainted with grief. The music was a language she could no longer speak. The next day, as predicted, her manager, Mr. Henderson, called her into his office. Douglas Croft's assistant had called. The offer was $1,000 for one night's work. $1,000. It was a lifeline. It was the tuition deposit for Leo. It was a month of breathing room. It was a deal with a devil she had only just met. "I'll do it." Ciara heard herself say the words, tasting like ash in her mouth. Mr. Henderson nodded, pleased. "Good. Croft is a valuable client. Don't mess it up." As she walked out of his office, the weight of her decision settled on her. She was willingly walking into the lion's den, and she couldn't shake the terrifying feeling that Douglas Croft knew exactly what he was doing. This wasn't just a job offer. It was a summons. Saturday arrived with a sky the color of a bruised plum. A nervous energy thrummed through Ciara all day, a low-grade hum of anxiety that made her hands tremble as she ironed her uniform. Leo, her 17-year-old brother, watched her from the doorway of their small living room. He had their father's thoughtful eyes and a lanky frame that seemed to grow an inch every week. "You okay, Chloe?" he asked, his voice laced with concern. "You've been quiet." Chiara forced a smile. "Just tired. Big gig tonight. The money's really good." She deliberately kept her tone light. Leo knew about their financial struggles, but she tried to shield him from the crushing weight of them. He also knew about her past, about the music she no longer made. He never pushed, but sometimes she would catch him looking at the silent piano in the corner with a wistful expression. "Is it at that Gilded Sparrow place again?" "No, a private party. For one of the regulars." She didn't mention Douglas Croft's name. Saying it aloud felt like invoking a curse. The address she had been given was for a sleek, impossibly tall skyscraper on the edge of Central Park, a needle of glass and steel that seemed to pierce the clouds. A private elevator operated by a security guard who checked her name on a list whisked her upwards. The ride was unnervingly silent and fast, her ears popping as she ascended. When the doors opened, they opened directly into the penthouse. Chiara's breath caught in her throat. If the Gilded Sparrow was opulent, this was celestial. The space was immense, a 2-story cavern of white marble glass and chrome. One entire wall was a window, looking out over the glittering expanse of Central Park and the city beyond. The lights twinkled like a carpet of diamonds. An open staircase, seemingly floating in mid-air, led to an upper level. Art that looked suspiciously like original Rothkos and Pollocks adorned the walls. The air smelled of money, expensive cologne, and a faint, subtle scent of orchids. She and 2 other waitstaff from the restaurant were greeted by Douglas's assistant, Cynthia, a severe-looking woman with a clipboard and an earpiece. Cynthia gave them a clipped, no-nonsense tour, pointing out the kitchen, the bar, and the bathrooms. Her tone made it clear they were part of the scenery, and scenery was expected to be flawless and silent. And then Chiara saw it. In the center of the main living area, positioned to take full advantage of the stunning view, was a piano. It wasn't just any piano. It was a Fazioli F301 the longest concert grand in the world, its polished ebony surface gleaming under the recessed lighting like a pool of black water. It was an instrument of breathtaking beauty and power, a statement piece that cost more than a house. Chiara's heart seized. She felt a magnetic pull towards it, an ache in her fingers she hadn't felt in years. It was a ghost from her past. But this one wasn't a dusty, forgotten upright. This was a living, breathing titan. She could almost hear the rich, resonant tones it was capable of producing. She quickly looked away, a cold sweat breaking out on her neck. The guests began to arrive, a river of couture gowns, bespoke suits and flashing jewelry. They were the titans of industry, the doyens of society, the beautiful and the powerful. Their laughter was loud and confident, echoing in the vast space. Chiara got to work, her server's mask slipping firmly into place. She moved through the crowd with a tray of champagne flutes, a ghost in her black and white uniform. She heard snippets of conversation, multi-million-dollar deals, trips to Verbier complaints about the traffic in the Hamptons. It was a world so far removed from her own, it might as well have been on another planet. Douglas Croft was in his element, the undisputed king of his domain. He moved through his guests with an easy charm, a hand on a shoulder here, a shared laugh there. Tinsley was fused to his side, preening under the attention, her diamond necklace catching the light and scattering it in blinding shards. At one point, Chiara was offering champagne near a small group when Tinsley's sharp voice cut through the chatter. Honestly, the service at these things is always so hit or miss, she said to a friend, loud enough for Chiara to hear. You'd think for what Dami pays they could at least find staff that doesn't look so dreary. Chiara didn't flinch. She kept her eyes forward, her expression serene, and moved on. But the word dreary echoed in her mind. It was how she felt. A dreary, colorless ghost. An hour into the party, while refilling glasses near the grand staircase, a voice startled her. That is a magnificent instrument, isn't it? Chiara turned to see an older woman, perhaps in her late 60s, with kind eyes and a cascade of elegant silver hair. She was dressed in a simple but exquisitely tailored deep blue gown, and she wore no jewelry save for a vintage-looking wedding band. Unlike the others, her gaze was direct and warm. Chiara was momentarily taken aback by being spoken to as a person. Yes, ma'am. It's beautiful. A Fazioli. The sound is unparalleled. So clear, so powerful. It takes a true artist to bring it to life. The woman said, her eyes fixed on the piano with a reverence Chiara understood completely. Do you play? The question was casual, but it landed like a physical blow. The air rushed from Chiara's lungs. The ghosts in her head started screaming. No, ma'am, I don't. She lied the words, feeling like sandpaper in her throat. The woman, Mrs. Eleanor Beaumont, simply nodded, a flicker of something disappointment, understanding in her eyes. A shame. Such a beautiful thing, sitting in silence. She gave Chiara a small, kind smile and moved away, leaving Chiara's heart racing. The interaction unsettled her. For the first time all night, someone had seen a flicker of the person behind the uniform, and it terrified her. As the evening progressed, a strange sense of foreboding began to creep over Chiara. She noticed Douglas watching her again. His gaze would find her across the crowded room, and he would hold it for a moment, that same cold, calculating smirk on his lips. He wasn't just observing her work anymore. He was waiting for something. The air grew thick with unspoken tension. The party was in full swing. The music was loud, The champagne was flowing, and the chatter was a deafening roar. Then Douglas Croft stepped onto the small raised platform near the staircase, tapping a glass for attention. The room gradually fell silent. Friends, colleagues, he began, his voice effortlessly commanding the space. Thank you all for coming to celebrate our latest success. We live in a world of surfaces, of carefully curated images and expected roles. He gestured around the room. But I've always believed that true value, true brilliance, often lies hidden beneath the surface. Sometimes you find it in the most unexpected of places. His eyes scanned the crowd, and then they locked onto Ciara. She was standing near the bar holding an empty tray. Her blood ran cold. Every muscle in her body screamed at her to run, to become invisible, to melt into the shadows. But she was pinned by his gaze, a butterfly on a board. For instance, Douglas continued, his voice dripping with a false, theatrical warmth. Our lovely waitress tonight, who has been so diligently keeping our glasses full. Ciara. He said her name. He said it to the entire room. And in that moment, Ciara knew this had been his plan all along. The job offer, the exorbitant pay, the specific invitation. It was all a setup. This was the game. I have it on good authority, he said, a wolfish grin spreading across his face, that Ciara here possesses a hidden talent, a secret soul for music. In fact, I believe she is quite the pianist. A murmur went through the crowd. Heads turned. 100 pairs of eyes, a mix of curiosity, amusement, and pity, all focused on her. Tinsley was smirking openly now, a look of vicious delight on her face. Ciara felt naked, exposed, the heat of 1,000 suns on her skin. He had somehow found out. He must have had someone look into her past. The thought was sickening, a profound violation. So Douglas said, his voice booming in the silent room. In the spirit of uncovering hidden talents, I would like to invite Ciara to grace us with a little performance on my new Fazioli. He gestured dramatically towards the magnificent piano. It wasn't an invitation. It was a death sentence. The silence in the penthouse was no longer the respectful hush for a host's speech. It was a thick, predatory silence, heavy with expectation. Every eye was on Ciara, a specimen under a microscope. She could feel their collective gaze as a physical weight pressing down on her, stealing the air from her lungs. Her mind raced a frantic, chaotic scramble for an escape that didn't exist. Douglas Croft stood on his platform, the master of ceremonies, in a theatre of cruelty he had constructed just for her. His smile was a mask of geniality, but his eyes were chips of ice glinting with a cold, triumphant fire. He knew he had her trapped. Don't be shy, Ciara, he purred, his voice oozing a condescending charm that made Ciara's skin crawl. Just a little something to entertain us. Ciara's training, her years of practiced invisibility, kicked in. She lifted her chin, her face, a pale but composed mask. I'm very sorry, Mr. Croft, she said, her voice remarkably steady, though her heart was a trapped bird beating against her ribs. But I'm here to work. I'm not an entertainer. A few people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. The raw power play was becoming too obvious, too crude for this sophisticated audience. But no one spoke up. No one challenged the king in his castle. Douglas's smile tightened almost imperceptibly at her refusal. This was part of the game, too, the defiance. He savored it. Oh, I insist, he said, his tone still light, but with a new, hard edge underneath. Think of it as a bonus. I'll tell you what. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a checkbook and a pen. With a flourish, he wrote something down. How does $10,000 sound for one song? A nice round number. He tore the check from the book and held it up. A gasp rippled through the room. $10,000. The number exploded in Ciara's mind. It wasn't a lifeline anymore. It was a gilded cage. It was more money than she had seen in her life. It could solve everything. It could pay for Leo's first year of college outright. It could get them out of their apartment. It could buy her peace of mind for months. And all it would cost was her soul. He was trying to buy her dignity, to prove that everything and everyone had a price. He was trying to turn her most sacred, painful memory into a cheap party trick for a room full of strangers. The humiliation was dizzying. Her mouth was dry. She looked from the check in his hand to the monstrous gleaming piano and then back to his face. She saw the truth there, the real reason for this spectacle. This wasn't about her. This was about him. It was a demonstration of his power, his ability to manipulate and control, to turn a human being into an object for his amusement. "No, thank you, sir," she said, her voice quieter now, but imbued with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "My answer is the same." The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The amusement vanished, replaced by a tense, shocked stillness. A waitress and nobody had just publicly refused Douglas Croft. Twice. Douglas's face finally lost its mask of charm. A flicker of raw, naked fury crossed his features before he reined it in. He descended the one step from the platform, his movements slow and deliberate like a predator closing in. He walked right up to her, invading her personal space, forcing her to tilt her head back to look up at him. The scent of his expensive cologne was suffocating. He lowered his voice so that only she could hear a venomous whisper against the backdrop of silence. "Let me be perfectly clear," he hissed, the affable host, gone replaced by the ruthless corporate raider Maya had described. "Your boss, Mr. Henderson, is a great admirer of my patronage. A single phone call from me and your exemplary career at the Gilded Sparrow is over. And I don't need to tell you that a bad reference from me in this city means you won't be serving canapés anywhere better than a back-alley diner for the rest of your life." He paused, letting the threat sink in. "I know you live in a shoebox in Queens with your brother. I know you're struggling. This isn't a request anymore." The violation of it, the fact that he had pried into the details of her life, sent a wave of nausea through her. This was premeditated. This was a calculated act of cruelty. He hadn't just stumbled upon her past. He had excavated it to use as a weapon. He straightened up his public voice, returning, though it was now laced with menace. "I'm not a patient man, Ciara. Play the piano, or you can collect your things and find yourself on the street." It was the ultimate checkmate. He had cornered her, using her poverty and her responsibilities as bars on a cage. If she refused, she lost her job, her income, her ability to care for Leo. Her future would be a bleak landscape of struggle and desperation. If she accepted, she would have to face the ghosts that had haunted her for 8 years. She would have to tear open a wound that had never truly healed and bleed for the entertainment of her tormentor. She looked around the room, her eyes desperately searching for an ally, a lifeline. Most people stared at their shoes at the art on the walls, anywhere but at her. They were complicit in their silence. Tinsley looked positively ecstatic, her eyes glittering with schadenfreude. Then Ciara's gaze met the eyes of the kind older woman, Mrs. Beaumont. There was no pity in her expression. Instead, there was a look of intense, profound empathy, and something else, a silent encouragement. It wasn't a promise of rescue, but a quiet affirmation of strength, as if she were saying, "You are more than he thinks you are." It was a tiny flicker of light in an overwhelming darkness. Ciara thought of Leo, his hopeful face, his future. She had been running from her past for 8 years, trying to build a new life out of grit and pragmatism. She had built walls around her heart, around her memories to protect herself from the pain. But what was the point of that fortress if it could be torn down by a rich bully in a penthouse? What good was her quiet dignity if it left her and her brother destitute? A strange calm settled over her. It wasn't surrender. It was something else. A shift in the battlefield. He thought he was forcing her to do his bidding. He thought he was about to witness her humiliation, a clumsy, tearful attempt at a song she had long forgotten. He thought he had won. But Douglas Croft had no idea who she really was. He had no idea what lived inside her. He had no idea what happened when you uncaged a storm. She took a slow, deep breath. She looked directly into Douglas's cold, triumphant eyes. "Fine," she said, her voice clear and ringing in the silent room. "I'll play." She didn't look at the check he still held. She turned her back on him, on the entire gawking crowd, and walked towards the piano. Each step was heavy, deliberate. The floor felt miles long. The Fazioli gleamed under the lights, a beautiful, terrifying monster. It was a coffin and a resurrection waiting for her. The ghosts of her parents walked with her. But for the first time, they weren't whispering warnings. They were walking beside her, their spectral hands on her shoulders. She was their daughter. The music was her birthright. He wanted to use it to shame her. Instead, she would use it to bury him. As Chiara approached the Fazioli, a hush fell over the penthouse, so profound it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. The clinking of ice, the distant city, hum, the very heartbeats of the 100 guests seemed to cease. All that existed was the woman in the simple black and white uniform and the monolithic black instrument that awaited her. She reached the piano bench and did not sit immediately. She ran a hand over the polished ebony fallboard, the wood cool and smooth beneath her trembling fingers. It felt like touching a memory, a tangible piece of a life she had locked away. For a moment, her composure threatened to crack. The image of her father's hands, strong, graceful, dancing over keys just like these, flashed behind her eyes, so vivid it stole her breath. A wave of grief, sharp and potent, washed over her. From across the room, she could feel Douglas Croft's smug satisfaction. He had won. He had broken her. Tinsley whispered something to a friend, followed by a stifled, cruel titter of laughter. They were expecting a spectacle of failure. A few fumbling, hesitant notes. Perhaps a tearful breakdown. Chiara closed her eyes. She inhaled the sterile, air-conditioned scent of the room and let it go. She pushed away the grief, the fear, the humiliation. She gathered all the rage, the injustice of the past 8 years, the sting of every condescending glance, every dismissive word. She thought of her brother Leo and the future she was fighting for. She thought of her parents, not their deaths, but the passion they had poured into her, the gift they had given her. This would not be a performance of shame. This would be a reckoning. She sat down on the bench, her back ramrod straight. She adjusted its height with a practiced fluid motion that did not go unnoticed by the few musically inclined guests in the room. She flexed her fingers, her hands hovering over the pristine ivory and ebony keys. The silence stretched, becoming taut, unbearable. And then she began. There was no gentle tentative prelude. The first notes exploded from the Fazioli with the force of a thunderclap. It was the opening of Frédéric Chopin's Etude in C minor opus tenor number 12, the revolutionary Etude. The choice was a declaration of war. The furious, cascading torrent of notes from her left hand was not just music. It was a physical manifestation of her rage. It was the storm that had been brewing inside her for years, finally unleashed. Her fingers, which moments ago had been trembling, were now a blur of controlled power, flying across the lower register of the keyboard, with a speed and ferocity that was breathtaking. The sound that erupted from the multi-million-dollar instrument was immense, a roaring gut punch of a sound that shook the very glass of the panoramic windows. The crowd flinched as one. Jaws, which had been set in smirks and pity, dropped in sheer unadulterated shock. Tinsley's giggle died in her throat, her face paling, her perfectly painted mouth hanging open. Across the room, Douglas Croft's smug expression dissolved. It melted away, replaced by a mask of stunned disbelief. This was not what he had planned. This was not the broken little waitress he had sought to humiliate. This was a virtuoso, a force of nature. His cruel game had backfired in the most spectacular way imaginable. Chiara was no longer in the penthouse. She was somewhere else entirely, a place where only the music existed. Her right hand entered, playing the powerful octave-laden main theme, a melody that was not a plea, but a defiant, majestic roar. It was a cry of rebellion against fate, against injustice, against him. She poured every ounce of her being into the music. The years of repressed grief for her parents became the piece's desperate, passionate heart. The daily grind of her life, the constant anxiety, the feeling of being invisible, it was all there in the turbulent arpeggios and furious chords. Her body moved with the music, a symphony of motion. Her shoulders, her arms, her entire torso, engaged in the act of creation. This wasn't the stiff, dreary waitress from Tinsley's cruel remark. This was an artist in the throes of their art, raw, powerful, and utterly captivating. The music swelled, filling every corner of the vast apartment. The sound was so immense, so full of complex emotion, it was almost a physical entity. It silenced the city beyond the glass. It silenced the petty thoughts and judgments of everyone present. They were no longer watching a waitress. They were bearing witness to a revelation. Mrs. Eleanor Beaumont stood near the staircase, her hands clasped to her chest. Tears were streaming freely down her face, but her expression was one of pure, radiant awe. She was not just hearing a masterpiece being played. She was hearing it being channeled, reinterpreted through a crucible of pain and resilience she could only begin to imagine. She recognized the phrasing, the particular emotional weight given to certain passages. It was an echo of a style she hadn't heard in years. The touch of her dear departed friends, the Jensens, passed down to their daughter. As the piece reached its frantic, desperate climax, a series of rapid, punishing chords, Ciara's attack on the keys was nothing short of brutal. It was the sound of a soul fighting its way out of a cage. The final thundering C minor chords were not just an ending, but a final defiant statement. A full stop, an exclamation point. Then silence. The last chord echoed in the vast room, hanging in the air for a long, pregnant moment, before fading into nothing. Chiara's hands dropped from the keys into her lap. Her chest was heaving, her hair slightly disheveled, her face flushed. The mask of the waitress was gone, burned away by the fire of her performance. In its place was the face of an artist, vulnerable and yet immensely powerful. For a heartbeat, the room remained frozen, suspended, in a state of collective shock. Then one person began to clap. It was Mrs. Beaumont. Her applause was slow, deliberate, and loud in the stillness. It broke the spell. Suddenly the room erupted. It wasn't polite party applause. It was a spontaneous, explosive ovation. People were on their feet, their faces alight with an astonishment that bordered on reverence. The sound was deafening, a roar of approval and awe. They were clapping for the music, for the talent, for the sheer unbelievable drama of what they had just witnessed. But Chiara didn't hear them. She slowly stood up from the piano bench, her legs feeling unsteady. She didn't look at the applauding crowd. She didn't acknowledge their praise. Her eyes found only one person. Douglas Croft. He was standing exactly where she had left him, looking like he had been turned to stone. His face was ashen, his blue eyes wide with a horrified understanding. He had wanted to expose a weakness, and instead, he had unveiled a superpower. He had tried to be the puppet master, and had been rendered a mere spectator at a show far grander and more profound than he could have ever conceived. In that moment, surrounded by his wealth, his power, and his sycophantic guests, he looked small, pathetic. Chiara held his gaze. There was no anger left in her, no hatred. All the fury had been poured into the piano, exorcised by the music. All that was left was a vast, quiet emptiness, and a flicker of something he had never seen before: pity. She turned to the small, ornate table next to the piano where Douglas's assistant had earlier placed the $10,000 check. She picked it up, and without looking at it, tore it neatly in half, and then in half again. She let the pieces flutter from her fingers onto the marble floor. Then she turned and walked away. Not towards the service exit, but towards the main elevator she had arrived in. She walked with her head held high, her back straight, cutting a path through the stunned, parting crowd. She didn't run. She didn't cry. She simply left, leaving behind a shattered party, a humbled millionaire, and the thunderous, lingering ghost of her music. The elevator doors slid shut, encasing Chiara in a silent, mirrored box. Her own reflection stared back at her, a stranger with flushed cheeks and wild eyes. The deafening applause from the penthouse was cut off, replaced by the gentle hum of the descending car. The adrenaline that had fueled her performance began to ebb, leaving a profound, bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. Her hands were shaking now, the aftermath of the storm. She had done it. She had faced the ghosts and walked through the fire. But what now? She had defied Douglas Croft, publicly shamed him in his own home, and torn up his money. She had almost certainly lost her job. The $1,000 fee for the night was gone. The $10,000 bribe was gone. She was walking out with nothing but the echo of the music and the bitter taste of a victory that might cost her everything. The elevator doors opened onto the cavernous, empty lobby. The night security guard looked up from his desk, his expression unreadable. Chiara walked across the polished marble floor, her sensible work shoes clicking with an unnerving loudness. She was halfway to the revolving doors, to the anonymity of the New York City night, when a voice called her name. "Miss Jensen." "Please wait." Chiara turned, hurrying towards her, her elegant blue gown rustling with her quick steps, was Mrs. Beaumont, the kind-faced woman from the party. Chiara braced herself, expecting pity, or perhaps a well-intentioned but useless platitude. "That was extraordinary," Mrs. Beaumont said, her voice still thick with emotion. She reached Chiara, her eyes clear and intelligent, searching Chiara's face. "What you did up there, that wasn't just playing. That was testimony." Chiara didn't know what to say. "Thank you," she murmured the words, feeling inadequate. "My name is Eleanor Beaumont," the woman said, extending a hand. Chiara shook it hesitantly. Mrs. Beaumont's grip was surprisingly firm, warm. "I need to ask you something. Your style, your phrasing, it's so familiar. The way you handle the dynamics in the left hand, the emotional weight you give to the lyrical passages. I've only ever known two people who played like that. A husband and wife. Both brilliant musicians, David and Lena Jensen." Chiara's heart stopped. She stared at Eleanor Beaumont, the name of her parents, hanging in the air between them like a fragile cord. They were my parents, she whispered, her voice cracking for the first time that night. Eleanor's face crumpled with a sudden dawning understanding and sorrow. She brought a hand to her mouth, her eyes widening. "Oh, my dear child," she breathed. "David and Lena, we were friends. Years ago. I was on the acquisitions board at the New York Philharmonic. We tried to commission a piece from your mother once. I lost touch with them after they moved out of the city for a quieter life to raise you." She looked at Ciara, her expression a mixture of grief and wonder. "We all heard about the accident. It was a tragedy, but the reports, we were told there were no survivors. We thought," her voice trailed off, "we thought the world had lost all of them." The world swam in front of Chiara's eyes. This woman knew her parents. She knew their music. She hadn't just heard a talented pianist tonight. She had heard a legacy, a ghost. "I was the only one who survived," Ciara said softly, the words she had spoken so many times, to therapists and social workers, now taking on a new, profound weight. "Your father," Eleanor continued, her voice gentle, "he used to say that music was the only honest language left in the world. He would have been so proud of the honesty you spoke with tonight." She paused, her gaze intense. "But he also would have been furious that you stopped playing. Why, Ciara? With a gift like that, why are you hiding it while serving champagne to monsters like Douglas Croft?" The question was direct, but not accusatory. It was born of a genuine, painful curiosity. And Ciara, for the first time in 8 years, told someone the complete truth. She spoke of the silence, after the crash, of how the sound of a piano became intertwined with the sound of shattering glass and sirens. She told her how the music that had once been her greatest joy had become her greatest source of pain, how the weight of survivor's guilt had crushed her passion, forcing her to run towards the most unmusical practical life she could imagine just to feel safe. Eleanor listened patiently, her expression full of a deep, sorrowful empathy. When Chiara finished her confession, hanging in the empty lobby, Eleanor placed a comforting hand on her arm. "Grief is a powerful silencer," she said softly. "But talent like yours, it doesn't die. It waits. Tonight, that man in his arrogance didn't humiliate you. He reminded you of who you are. He forced you to speak your native tongue again." She reached into her small, elegant clutch and pulled out a card. It was thick, cream-colored stock, embossed with a simple, elegant crest. "I am no longer with the Philharmonic," Eleanor said. "For the last decade, I have served on the board of trustees for the Juilliard School." Ciara stared at the name, the legendary institution, a mythical place from her parents' stories. "Your father was one of the most brilliant students to ever pass through its halls," Eleanor went on. "We have a scholarship fund, the Beaumont Legacy Grant, for exceptionally gifted musicians who face extraordinary circumstances. It's a full ride. It covers tuition, housing, all expenses." She pressed the card into Chiara's hand. "The position is currently vacant. I want you to have it." Ciara looked from the card to Eleanor's face, speechless. This was impossible. This couldn't be happening. "This isn't charity," Ciara, Eleanor said firmly, as if reading her mind. "Charity is what Douglas Croft tried to offer you. This is an investment. I heard your parents' legacy in your playing tonight, but I also heard your own voice, fierce, brilliant, and entirely your own. That voice deserves to be heard on the world's concert stages, not silenced in a penthouse. The world needs artists like you." The revolving doors swished open, and a blast of cool night air washed over them. Chiara looked down at the card in her hand. It felt heavier than any check. It wasn't just an offer. It was a key. a key to a door she had thought was locked and sealed forever. "Call me tomorrow," Eleanor said with a warm smile. "We have much to discuss." With a final reassuring squeeze of Chiara's arm, Mrs. Beaumont turned and walked towards a black town car that had pulled up to the curb. Chiara stood alone in the center of the lobby, the card clutched in her hand. She had walked into that penthouse, a waitress, a ghost, a victim. She was walking out as something else, entirely. The music hadn't just been a reckoning for Douglas Croft. It had been a reclamation for herself. The silence was finally over. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of change. The day after the party, Ciara called Mr. Henderson to quit her job. To her surprise, he was apologetic, almost fawning. News of the incident had spread like wildfire through Manhattan's elite circles. The story whispered over brunches and business lunches was not about a millionaire putting a waitress in her place, but about the arrogant Douglas Croft being spectacularly humbled by a secret prodigy. Croft's reputation had taken a significant hit. His calculated cruelty had been exposed as a thuggish lack of class. Forcing a waitress to play the piano was one thing. Being upstaged by her genius was an unforgivable social blunder. Ciara met with Eleanor Beaumont 3 days later in a sunlit cafe in the West Village. Over coffee, they talked for hours. Eleanor shared stories about her parents that Chiara had never heard, painting a vibrant picture of their passion and their love for each other and their art. For the first time, Ciara felt like she was connecting with their memory, not through the lens of grief, but through the shared language of music. By the end of their meeting, Ciara had formally accepted the Beaumont Legacy Grant. Her life began to reorient itself around a new son. She and Leo packed up the few belongings in their cramped Queen's apartment. As she folded clothes and wrapped dishes, Ciara felt a profound sense of lightness. She was not just moving house, she was shedding an old skin. The last thing to be moved was the old Baldwin upright piano. She had called a specialist moving company, the same one her father had always used. Before they took it away, she lifted the dusty cloth, the scent of old wood, and felt rising to meet her. She opened the lid. The keys, yellowed with age, looked like a familiar smile. Sitting on the worn bench, she let her fingers rest on the keys. She thought of the Fazioli, of its thunderous power. Then she thought of this piano, of the thousands of hours her father had played it, of the first simple scales he had taught her. This was not an instrument of war. This was an instrument of love. Softly she began to play. Not a furious etude, but a gentle lyrical nocturne by Chopin. The melody, sweet and melancholic, filled the small apartment. Leo, who had been taping up a box in the other room, stopped and came to the doorway. He leaned against the frame, a slow, wide smile spreading across his face. He didn't say a word, just listened, his eyes shining. The silence in their home, the heavy 8-year silence, was finally irrevocably broken. Meanwhile, in his glass and marble cage overlooking Central Park, Douglas Croft was learning the true meaning of silence. The party had become a fiasco he couldn't spin. Tinsley, who valued strength and public perception above all else, saw his humiliation as a fatal weakness. She left him a week later, her departure as cold and transactional as their entire relationship had been. Business associates, who had once fawned over him, were now cooler, more distant. He had shown them his true character, and it was ugly. One evening, sitting alone in his vast living room, he found himself staring at the Fazioli. It was no longer a symbol of his wealth and power. It was a monument to his folly, a gleaming black tombstone marking the death of his arrogance. He had tried to own beauty to command it, and it had turned on him with a power he could never comprehend. He picked up his phone and found Chiara Jensen's number, which his assistant had procured for him. He wanted to apologize, to explain, to what he didn't even know. He pressed the call button, but it went straight to voicemail. Her old number was already disconnected. She was gone. He was left with nothing but the silence and the view. 3 months later. The autumn sunlight streamed through the tall, arched windows of a practice room at the Juilliard School. The room was simple, dominated by a magnificent Steinway grand piano. Chiara sat at the keyboard, her posture relaxed, her expression focused but serene. She wasn't playing with the fury of that night in the penthouse, nor the somber grief of her past. She was playing with a newfound sense of joy and discovery. The music flowed from her intricate and alive. The door opened softly, and Leo peered in, now a freshman at NYU, his tuition fully covered. He grinned at her. "Sounding good, Chloe." She smiled back, a genuine, unburdened smile. "Just warming up. Eleanor is taking us to the Philharmonic tonight. Perlman is playing." She had found more than a scholarship in Eleanor Beaumont. She had found a mentor, a friend, and a living link to her parents. She was not just a student at Juilliard. She was home. She had reclaimed her past, not as a source of pain, but as the foundation of her strength. Her parents' legacy lived on, not as a ghost, but as the music that flowed through her fingers. She looked at her hands on the keys, then out the window at the bustling New York City streets. She had once been an invisible girl serving a world that refused to see her. But in one defiant act, forced upon her by a cruel man, she had found her voice. And it was a voice that was just beginning to sing. That single night in the penthouse changed everything. It wasn't just about a waitress shocking a room full of rich people. It was about the incredible power that lies dormant within us, waiting for the right, or in this case, the wrong moment to be unleashed. Chiara's story reminds us that true wealth isn't measured by bank accounts or penthouse views, but by the richness of our spirit, our resilience, and the talents we nurture. Douglas Croft had all the money in the world, but he was poor in the ways that truly matter. Ciara, who had nothing discovered, she possessed a treasure that no one could ever buy or take from her. Her story is a testament to the fact that our deepest wounds can sometimes become the source of our greatest strength. If Chiara's journey from silent waitress to powerful artist resonated with you, please give this video a like and share it with someone who might need a reminder of their own hidden power. And don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more true life stories of triumph and transformation. What's your hidden talent? Let us know in the comments below.